Hello everyone, this is Brent from An Ordinary Shepherd, continuing on our series on the 10 Commandments. So we've gotten the first 2 commandments grouped together. We've done 2 different series on the 3rd commandment, and so now we're moving on. So now we're to the 4th commandment. So we're going to go to Exodus, all the 10 commandments, back to Exodus chapter 20. And this one's in verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the ever-living your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son nor daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the ever-living made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the ever-living blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Okay, so in a nutshell, we're talking about the Sabbath here. So, which is the 7th day of the week. So let's go back to Genesis, where they talked about creation. Okay, and this is Genesis chapter 2, verse 2. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he'd been doing, so on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. And so you can see here that we're talking about the Sabbath day. So let's go into a little bit more detail. So it says do no work. It says none of the people in your house should do work. So we see that the Sabbath was from the beginning of creation. There were 6 days, however you want to look at that. We may come around to that in another video. There's the 7th day where God rested. And so when he's giving the 10 Commandments, which are the underpinnings, the framework of the law given by which under the Old Covenant, remember the Jewish people followed the Old Covenant in the Old Testament, and they were blessed for it, and if they disobeyed the law, then they were punished for it. Well, this is part of the undergirding framework of that Old Covenant. So this is the law. This is what they had to follow to receive God's blessing. Okay, so let's look at Exodus 16:23, so a little bit before. So he said to them, "This is what the ever-living commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the ever-living. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it till morning." So this is one of the principles of the Sabbath, where you do twice as much work on the day before, on the 6th day, so that on the 7th day you would have enough to last you. Or I guess you could just do, nowadays you just do a little bit more throughout the whole week, since we've got good preservatives, and you'd have all your food and everything ready, okay, so that you wouldn't have to prepare anything on the Sabbath day. All right, so let's keep going. Let's look at Exodus chapter 31, and we're going to start in verse 12. Then the ever-living said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths. This will be a sign between me and you for the generations to come, so that you may know that I am the ever-living who makes you holy. Observe the Sabbath because it is holy to you. Anyone who desecrates it is to be put to death. Those who do any work on that day must be cut off from their people. For 6 days work is to be done, but the 7th day is a day of Sabbath rest, holy to the ever-living. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day is to be put to death. The Israelites are to observe the Sabbath, celebrating it for generations to come as a lasting covenant. It will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever. For in 6 days the ever-living made the heavens and the earth, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed." Okay, so here we've got a few things that come out of that passage. One, what's the punishment? Okay, so we've got a law, we've got a rule, we need a punishment for breaking the rule. And apparently this is such an important rule that breaking it means that you die. Okay, so this is one of those sins that directly leads to death. At least under that Old Covenant, the appropriate punishment under their legal system was death for someone who violated the Sabbath. So it's a pretty big deal. And like I said, this is to be a holy sign. This is supposed to be something that's supposed to last throughout their generations forever. It says this will be a sign between them, he and them forever, and that they keep his Sabbaths and no one else does. Okay, so this sets them apart. That's what holy means, is to be set apart. So by not working on the seventh day, they are clearly setting themselves apart from the rest of the world. And so they're when you're set apart, you're doing something different than everybody else. And so, but what they're doing is holy because that's what God did when he had his creation, and that gets reinforced over and over again. Okay, next we're going to go to Exodus 35. Okay, we're going to start in chapter 1. Moses assembled the whole Israelite community and said to them, "These are the things the ever-living has commanded you to do. For 6 days work is to be done, but the seventh day shall be your holy day, a day of Sabbath rest to the ever-living. Whoever does any work on it is to be put to death. Do not light a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day." Okay, so we've got a new commandment in there. We've heard about how he wants them to work for 6 days, which is, again, there's the other flip half to that, which we won't get into much detail, is you're supposed to work for 6 days. You're not supposed to work for 3 days and then take the Sabbath off and then take 4 more days off, okay? According to the way God wants this done, 6 days of work, 7th-day Sabbath, okay? At least under this old system here. But we've got a new commandment. We've got a new thing kind of tacked onto the end here, which is do not light a fire. So this is, we talked about not doing work, and we'll get in later into the definition of work because it's never quite spelled out. But this is the one thing that's explicitly spelled out as far as you don't work, you are commanded to rest, and you are commanded not to light a fire. Okay, so let's look at what happens when somebody breaks the Sabbath. Numbers 15:32. Okay, while the Israelites were in the wilderness, a man was found gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses and Aaron and the whole assembly, and they kept him in custody, because it was not clear what should be done to him. Well, why isn't that clear? Because they don't know. Does gathering wood count as work? Was he working? Was he getting paid? But we don't know. We know he was doing something on the Sabbath. We don't know if it was bad or not, so let's go ask God and Moses. So then they went to then the ever-living said to Moses, "The man must die. The whole assembly must stone him outside the camp." So the assembly took him outside the camp and stoned him to death, as the ever-living commanded Moses. Okay, so now we've got 2 things that you definitely should not do on the Sabbath. Well, 3 actually. You should not work, you should not light a fire, and you should not gather sticks. We can only surmise from the text, we have to guess because it's not given explicitly, that he probably was gathering sticks to build a fire. And God knew that. God knew his heart. And so God could look into his heart, see what his intention was, and see that his intention was to gather sticks to light a fire and violate the Sabbath. And so the fact that he was interrupted before he can do that doesn't make him any less guilty. Because God knows his heart. God knows that he had the will to violate the Sabbath, and he was acting toward that. And just because you want to sin and don't have the opportunity doesn't make you holy. Okay, so now there's another. So we've talked about the Sabbath day, okay, and we're still in the Old Testament, so we're still under the Old Covenant here. So the Sabbath day went from night of the 6th day to night of the 7th day. So the Hebrew day started at sunset. And so it lasted from the sunset of one day to sunset of the next day. Now, the Sabbath day was that 7th one, okay? So in the modern equivalent, if you're like me and live in America or someone else that uses a Gregorian calendar, or at least a revised Gregorian calendar, we don't have those days of the week. We've got names for our days of the week, okay? So the Sabbath, if you're looking at the Sabbath, the modern Jewish people celebrate the Sabbath from the night of Friday to the night of Saturday. Now, as you know, I'm clearly a Christian, so why do I care what the modern Jewish people do? Well, they're still following the Sabbath that Jesus Christ followed. So, for different reasons, I cannot say 100% that they follow the same Sabbath that Moses followed. Okay? There were some major interruptions during the worship of the Jewish people where it's possible that some of the things were lost in the meantime. Okay? And you can find that in some of the Kings and Chronicles where they go back into the temple and they find a book of the law that's been lost for a generation. And so they have to start over from scratch, basically. But we do know we can follow an unbroken line of Judaism from the time when Christ was alive. And you would think if anyone would know when the Sabbath was supposed to be, it'd be Jesus. And we'll get into the why of that in just a second. So Jesus was alive. He celebrated the Sabbath, or he honored the Sabbath anyway. And from the time that he was alive till the time to now, we've got an unbroken stream of relatively preserved Judaism. No offense to Jewish people here, but relatively preserved practice of Judaism. And so we can say that they're following the same Friday night to Saturday night, if you want to use our calendar. They're using the same day for the Sabbath that Jesus used for his Sabbath. Okay? So you can talk about how it could have been changed to Sunday. You can talk about how, some calendars have Monday as the first day of the week and Sunday as the last day of the week. So midnight to midnight on Sunday. You can go into all these arguments, except if you're going to do it the way Jesus did it, he did it from Friday at sundown to Saturday at sundown. Okay. And so moving on. Okay, so we've got some other Sabbath concepts that need to come in here. Okay, so if you look at Exodus 23, okay, we've got Sabbath years. For 6 years, you are to sow your fields and harvest the crops. But during the 7th year, let the land lie unplowed and unused. Then let the poor among your people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what is left. Do the same with your vineyard and with your with your olive grove. Okay, so we've got a Sabbath year. Okay, so every 6 years they were supposed to work the land. But every 7th year, the land was supposed to get a rest. So can you imagine, you're a farmer, you work 6 years in a row, and then all of a sudden you don't work for an entire year. That seems like a pretty good, I don't think anybody anywhere does that sort of thing now, and unfortunately the Israeli people then didn't do it either. But that's where the sabbatical comes from, if you've ever heard of that in universities or if you're in a profession blessed enough to actually get a sabbatical, is to where you get a year where you're not working, okay, but you still enjoy the fruits of your labor and the blessings of God. Well, unfortunately, the Israeli people did not follow this, and they spent 490 years in the land of Israel from the time that Joshua brought them over until the time that they were taken into captivity. And they never celebrated a single Sabbath year. Okay? So, even though they were supposed to, according to Exodus 23. So, what do you think happened? So, when they were in captivity, how long do you think they were in captivity? How many Sabbath years did they miss? Well, let's go to Jeremiah 25. This whole country will become a desolate wasteland, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Anyone know what 490 divided by 7 is? But when the 70 years are fulfilled, I will punish the king of Babylon and his nation, the land of the Babylonians, for their guilt, declares the ever-living, and I will make it desolate forever. And I will bring on that all the things I have spoken against it, all that are written in this book and prophesied by Jeremiah. Okay, why 70 years? 2 Chronicles. Okay, going to 2 Chronicles 36. He carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his successors until the kingdom of Persia came to power. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation it rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the ever-living spoken by Jeremiah. Okay, so the Israeli people were carried off into captivity. We talked about, okay, there's direct consequences for them not following God's instructions. If they do what he says, they're blessed. If they don't, they're cursed. Well, they were in the land 490 years, and the land needed 70 years of Sabbath rest to recover. So it doesn't seem like they ever kept this, even a single time. Okay, so we've got through some Old Covenant stuff on the Sabbath. Some other kind of misconfusing things. All the rest days for the feasts are called Sabbaths as well. So when you talk about Yom Kippur or the Day of Soundings and some of these other festivals, they're Sabbath days as well. So people weren't supposed to work on them. So if you look at the Old Testament, it's actually not too bad. You work 6 days a week, usually from sun up to sundown. You have a whole day off, which for the ancient world is pretty impressive. You get 7 additional Sabbath days during the year for holy feasts. And every 7th year, you don't work. So, not a bad deal all around. Okay, so, I don't know what it works out to as far as considered a modern day with our 2 days off and 2 to 3 weeks vacation and all the rest of it, but not too bad to start with. Certainly see how you can be doable, especially compared to some of the other civilizations of the time. Okay, so let's go. The other thing to point out is we talked about no fires and no sticks, and those are pretty explicit. No work is kind of a larger sort of thing, so that's much more of a philosophical discussion of, okay, well, if I ride my bike around around my yard or around my around my street, is that considered work? Okay, well, what if Lance Armstrong did it before all the issues happened with him? It's his job. So if he cycled on that day, would it be work? I don't know the answer. If you're on vacation and taking photos on the Sabbath day, is that work? But what if you're a photographer and you're taking wedding photos for money on the Sabbath day? Is that work? Like I say, you get into a lot of discussions here about what's work and what's not work, and if you decide you want to keep the Sabbath, fantastic. That if you're going to keep the 10 Commandments, I know a lot of Christians have a commitment to do that, then that's certainly the hardest one, I think, of all of those to do, and congratulations, but you just have to pray about that, and God will give you the answers He wants you to have. Unfortunately, I don't have all the answers when it comes to things like that. Okay, so we talked about the Old Testament. Let's talk about the New Testament. So under the New Covenant, what are we to do with the Sabbath? Okay, so let's go back to Matthew 12. Jumping forward to the New Testament, to the right side of the book. Okay, at the time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to Him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." Okay, just for kind of a background, you can go through the entire Old Testament and never find anywhere where picking grain on the Sabbath is work. Okay. However, the Pharisees were unique in that they had their own set of laws in addition to the laws in the Bible, and they followed them just as rigidly. And one of their laws clearly said that you are not to break grain with your hands on the Sabbath, that was considered work. So when they saw His disciples doing this, even though it's not biblical, they called them out on it because they were going against tradition. He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on the Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath, and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." Going from that place, He went to their synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" And He said to them, "If any of you has a sheep, and it falls into the pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." He said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And so he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Okay, so here we have Jesus, and He's talking about the Sabbath. And as opposed to a lot of the New Testament, the New Covenant teachings, Jesus right now isn't teaching about the New Covenant. He's teaching about the Old Covenant, because the Pharisees are attacking Him on the Old Covenant, and He's talking about, okay, now this is what the Old Covenant means when it regards to the Sabbath. So let's look at the first example they talked about, and that's David. And so if you want to find that example, you need to go to 1 Samuel, and you go to chapter 21, and it's verses 1 through 6. So David went to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he met him and asked, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" David answered Ahimelech the priest, "The king sent me on a mission and said to me, 'No one is to know anything about the mission I am sending you on. As for men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever you can find.' But the priest answered David, 'I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women.' David replied, 'Indeed, women have been kept from us as usual whenever I set out. The men's bodies are holy, even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today?' So the priest gave him consecrated bread, since there was no bread except the bread of the presence, which had been removed from before the Lord, from the ever-living, and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away." Okay, so if you'll read through Deuteronomy, when they talk about the showbread, they would cook bread, they would put it in front of the tent and God, in the tent of the tabernacle, and it would be in the presence of God, and they called it the bread of the presence. And then it would be taken away, it would be changed out twice a day. And the only people who could eat this were priests, and it was a sin for anyone else but a priest to try to eat this bread. But here we have David and a bunch of warriors that he has with him, and he's going up to the temple, up to the tabernacle anyway, this was before the temple was built, and he's asking these priests who have this bread, and they're giving it to him. Why are they doing this? Well, this is something that Jesus was bringing up. He was doing something that wasn't lawful to do. Why? Because he was on a mission from God. He was God's anointed, David, and he was doing God's work. And so God does not withhold things from people doing his work. Because this bread was so holy, the priests wanted to make sure that the men were ceremonially clean to eat it, and they hadn't been around women or touched any dead things or things like this. The only thing they bring up here is being with women, because that makes you ceremonially unclean for a very short time. And so he wanted to make sure that they were ceremonially clean and they wouldn't sin by eating it, because they were on a mission. And so really they're on a mission from God, so this was okay. The next example Jesus brings up in regards to the Old Testament version of the Sabbath is in Numbers 28, okay? So I'm going to bring that up for you. We're going to start right at the beginning in chapter 1. So the ever-living said to Moses, "Give this command to the Israelites, and say to them, make sure that you present to me at the appointed time my food offerings as an aroma pleasing to me." This is the food offering you are to present to the ever-living. 2 lambs, a year old without defect, as a regular burnt offering every day. 1 in the morning and 1 at twilight, together with a grain offering of 1/10 of an ephah. You have to excuse my pronunciation. Of the finest flour mixed with 1/4 of hin of oil from pressed olives. This is the regular burnt offering instituted at Mount Sinai as a pleasing aroma, a food offering presented to the ever-living. Okay, so let's move on down a little bit, okay? And let's talk about on the Sabbath offering. So that's in verse 9. On the Sabbath day, make an offering of 2 lambs, a year old without defect, together with its drink offering, and a grain offering of 2/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with oil. This is the burnt offering for the Sabbath, in addition to the regular burnt offering and its drink offering. And so this is where Jesus is talking about the priests profaning the Sabbath. Not only are they doing the normal work that they do 6 days a week, they do twice as much work on the Sabbath. And yet it's okay. They're not sinning. They're innocent. Why? Because God told them to do it. And so Jesus first says, listen, David was on a mission from God, so it made what he did okay. These men are priests. They're doing exactly what God told them to do, so they're not sinning. Okay? So you can see that Jesus is drawing parallels here when he heals people on the Sabbath, or when he walks somewhere on the Sabbath. He is on a mission from God. Not only that, he says he's the Lord of the Sabbath. So even if he wasn't the Lord of the Sabbath, he's on a mission from God, and he's doing what God is telling him to do. So it cannot be sinful. Even under other circumstances, they may have had an argument. Plus, Jesus is God. He's the Lord of the Sabbath, and he says that. So what about the New Testament? What does the New Testament have to say in the New Covenant? Because Jesus, when he's talking in Matthew, is really just recapping what the law really means under the Old Covenant. So what is the New Covenant Sabbath for us? So if you look in Hebrews chapter 4, okay, my little heading under this is a Sabbath rest for the people of God, okay? And so we'll go from there. Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you shall be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us just as they did, but the message they heard was of no value to them because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. Now we who have believed enter that rest, just as God has said, so I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. And yet his works have been finished since the creation of the world. For somewhere he has spoken about the seventh day in these words, on the seventh day God rested from all his works. So here they're drawing the parallel between rest and the Sabbath as being very similar or very associated. And again in the passage above he says, they shall never enter my rest. Therefore, since it remains for some to enter that rest, and since those who formerly had the good news proclaimed to them did not go because of their disobedience, God again set a certain day, calling it today. This he did when a long time later he spoke through David, as in the passage already quoted. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken about another day. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God, for anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Okay, so you may be thinking about that. Okay, what does that mean? What is he talking about here? It's kind of subtle. He's kind of dancing around an issue here. And so let's go to Revelation 14:13, just to kind of hammer this point home a little bit. Okay. Then I heard a voice from heaven say, write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labor, and their deeds will follow them. Okay, so in the New Testament, between Matthew and between these passages, unfortunately, the Sabbath rest is not a luxury that Christians get. We are on missions from God. We are here to do God's work. The Sabbath is not an obstacle to doing God's work. We're called to do good and to continue on the mission that God has given us even on the Sabbath. And this is something that hits me very personally as I'm a physician, and a lot of times people get sick. Babies need to be delivered. Bad things happen on the Sabbath day. And you know what? If I were going to be a strict observer of the Sabbath, this is what Jesus says. I was called to this by God. This is my mission from God to perform these duties. And if I'm not doing them on the Sabbath just because it's the Sabbath, then I'm sinning because I'm supposed to be doing God's will. And it's not a sin for me to go and work on the Sabbath. Now, that's a completely different situation than someone having the Sabbath and deciding that they're going to go, have a day, that they're not having a day dedicated to the worship of God, and that they're going to go be frivolous and that they're going to work extra overtime just because they want to, or something like this. I don't think Jesus gave justification for that at all, even though he is the Lord of the Sabbath. But as long as you're doing God's work, then unfortunately the Sabbath is a rest, is a blessing that's not given to us in our covenant. However, the blessing that we do get, the Sabbath rest of God from Hebrews and Revelations, is when we're dead, when we're in heaven. We'll have a Sabbath rest with God, when we'll rest from our labors. So we'll be with God, and that is the rest that we're promised, and we don't get it until we die, unfortunately. So every Sabbath day that I don't have to work is a blessing, but it doesn't happen all the time. That's not the promise that we were given. That's the promise that they had under the old covenant, is to keep God's Sabbath day. But under the new covenant, we work and we do God's will whenever he wants it done, hopefully all the time. And when we die, we'll get our Sabbath rest then. All right, thanks everybody for checking in, and we'll try to keep you updated on when the new videos are coming out. And the next one will be on the fifth commandment, if you hadn't figured out the pattern yet. Anyway, be blessed. Thank you. Bye-bye.